All right, let's dive into a legal case from 1970s India that honestly feels more like a movie script than a dry court document. It's a story about a really personal struggle that ended up in a courtroom, forcing judges to ask some huge questions, like what is a marriage, really? And what happens when one of the most basic parts of it is just gone? This is a story about love, the law, and a deep, profound kind of loneliness.
So, the whole entire story really boils down to this one central question. Can a marriage that has no sex be considered a form of legal cruelty? Now, this wasn't just some philosophical debate for a law school class. For one woman, the answer to this question was literally going to decide the rest of her life.
Okay, so let's meet the people at the heart of this. We've got Rita and Balakishan Nijhawan. They got married back in 1954. And, from the outside looking in, it probably seemed like a totally normal marriage. But behind closed doors, Rita would later claim there was a painful secret, that for more than 10 years, their marriage was just a piece of paper, completely missing any kind of physical intimacy.
And listen, this wasn't just a rough patch. Just take a look at this timeline. It's pretty staggering. They get married in '54. It takes 3 whole years for Rita to even find out from a cousin what a normal marital relationship is supposed to look like. Then a son is born in 1959, and yeah, we're definitely going to come back to that detail. By '62, her husband even admits to his weakness in a letter. But it's not until 1967, a full 13 years after she got married, that Rita finally goes to the courts for help. 13 years. Can you imagine?
The way Rita herself described it is just heartbreaking. She called her marriage a shadow and a shell. Just try to imagine the emotional toll of that. She testified about years of depression, of frustration, and just the pure anguish of being denied this really fundamental part of a partnership, all while she was in the prime of her life.
So when this all finally lands in a courtroom, Rita's lawyers knew they had a really tough road ahead. So they got clever. They came up with a 2-pronged strategy, making 2 very different arguments to try and win her case. Okay, so their first argument was pretty technical. They went for impotence. Now, you have to understand, the legal definition at the time was incredibly strict. It meant a persistent, total inability to achieve penetration. Even one single instance of consummation would have completely sunk their claim. So yeah, it was an extremely high bar to clear.
So to try and meet that super high bar, Rita gave her own testimony, and her parents backed her up. They also had what seemed like a smoking gun, that letter from 1962 where her husband admits his weakness. But that left one giant, obvious question. What about their son? To get around this, her lawyers made a really rare argument, something called fecundation ab extra. It's a medical thing where conception can, in very rare cases, happen without full penetration.
But, and this is where things get really fascinating, her lawyers had a plan B, a much more groundbreaking argument. They pitched this radical idea. What if the real issue wasn't the cause, but the effect? They argued that the constant denial of intimacy was, in and of itself, a form of mental cruelty, that it was causing her real psychological harm, whether her husband actually meant to hurt her or not.
Well, of course, Balakishan had a completely different story to tell. His defense painted a picture not of any sexual problems, but of a perfectly happy marriage that was sabotaged by a family fight over money.
I mean, the 2 stories could not be more different. On one side, you have Rita saying the marriage was a shell from the very beginning because of sexual deprivation. On the other side, Balakishan is saying, nope, not true. We were a happy, well-adjusted couple right up until 1965. And what happened in 1965? A big fight over a 10,000 rupee loan from her father.
And his evidence was simple, and honestly, pretty powerful. First, their son. How could he possibly be impotent if they had a child together, right? Second, he brought out letters Rita had written to him. He argued that before this money dispute in '65, the letters were affectionate. Afterwards, they turned cold and formal. He claimed this was the real proof, that money, not sex, was the problem.
So with 2 totally opposing stories, the entire case landed in the lap of Justice Rajinder Sachar of the Delhi High Court. And his decision wasn't just going to decide the fate of this one couple, it was going to set a major precedent for so many others.
First, the ruling on impotence. The court looked at that super strict legal definition and the really high burden of proof. And considering they had a child, and there were some contradictions in Rita's story, the court decided she just hadn't met that burden. The claim was denied. And for a moment, it really seemed like she had lost.
But then came the second ruling, the decisive one. On the grounds of mental cruelty, The court sided with Rita. Judicial separation was granted. So she lost on the technical point, but she won on the human one.
And the logic the judge used here is what makes this case so powerful. Justice Sacher wrote a sentence that became the heart of the whole thing. He said it doesn't matter why the denial of sex happens, whether it's on purpose or because of a physical problem. What matters is the result, the frustration and misery it causes the other person. You see? The focus totally shifted from intent to impact.
And the judgment went even further. It declared that, quote, marriage without sex is an anathema, which basically means a thing to be hated or loathed. The court was saying loud and clear that a healthy sexual relationship isn't just a nice bonus, it's part of the very foundation of what a marriage is.
So, Rita won her separation, but the story, it doesn't end there. The ripple effects from this one single ruling were huge. It fundamentally changed the whole landscape of Indian matrimonial law. And you can literally see the impact unfold over the years. In 1973, the case sets this new precedent. Then, just 3 years later, Parliament actually amends the Hindu Marriage Act, officially adding cruelty as grounds for divorce. They essentially wrote this court's ruling into national law. And even decades later, India's Supreme Court would still be citing the Rita Nijhawan case. That's how big of a deal it was.
So, what's the big takeaway here? This single ruling did 4 pretty revolutionary things. It recognized a woman's right to sexual satisfaction in her marriage. It expanded the definition of cruelty way beyond just physical violence to include mental and psychological harm. It focused on the effect of an action, not the cause. And it showed the incredible power of the courts to innovate and push the law forward.
And all of this leaves us with a lingering question, one that's just as relevant today as it was back in 1973. How should the law balance preserving an institution like marriage with the fundamental need to protect the well-being and happiness of the actual individuals inside of it? It's a tough one to think about.